Folks, let me continue going over some things. You are all muted right now. There is closed captioning. If you're not interested in closed captioning, you'll be able to turn that off at the bottom of your Zoom screen. This is being recorded. So if you are not interested in being recorded, you can turn your video off, and you can also mute yourself, which you are already muted. Right now, we want to welcome you. If you'd like to, with your name, if you'd like to put in your preferred pronouns, we would love that if they're not already in your name. And you can click on your like little square on the upper right hand, 3 dots, and it should be able to ask, there should be a rename button if you want to put in your pronouns, your preferred pronouns. That'd be great. Let's see, still more people coming in. All right. Okay, what also is going to happen is at points in the program, Rabbi Nikki is going to be asking some questions. What you should do, since we have such a large group, is put your questions in the chat, and Heshi will be collecting those questions, where later on Rabbi Nikki will want those to respond to. And let's see. Okay, I'm going to first introduce Heshi. Heshi and Ellen are co-chairs of PRISM at Road of Shalom, and Heshi is going to introduce Rabbi Nikki. Oh, you're muted, Heshi.
Always the mute. Welcome and good evening. As Fred said, my name is Heshi Zimman, and I'm co-chair of PRISM along with Ellen Poster. PRISM is the LGBTQIA connection group at RS. This evening's program is co-sponsored by Road of Shalom and PRISM. This is the second of 2 programs brought to commemorate and celebrate LGBTQ Pride Month at RS. Rabbi Nikki DeBlosi returns to RS after her presentation this past Purim on drag, gender identity, and Jewish community blew the audience away, and we just had to have her back to help us celebrate LGBTQ Pride. Named in 2015 by The Forward as one of America's most inspiring rabbis, Rabbi Nikki DeBlosi is a freelance writer, speaker, teacher, and spiritual counselor. Ordained as a Reform rabbi in 2013, she combines a high-level academic background with a very approachable presence. Her interests include queer and feminist theory, sexuality and relationships, pastoral care, liturgy, and expanding life cycle ritual. A convert herself, Rabbi Nikki helps folks find community and belonging. She's also a parent to 2 school-age children. Friends and fellow congregants, I give you Rabbi Nikki DeBlosi.
Thank you so much, Heshi and Ellen and Fred, for that introduction, and to all of you for welcoming me back to the Road of Shalom community. I had a great time with y'all at Purim, and we're going to begin, as is the custom in this community, as we're about to engage in words of Torah. And all of the words we're going to engage in, I'm going to argue, are words of Torah. The word Torah from the same root as horim, parents, people who point the way, texts that point the way. And so let's recite the blessing together for the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, eternal our God, sovereign of all, who hallows us with mitzvot, commanding us to engage with words of Torah. I'm going to ask y'all to engage with words of Torah with me and the community. If you have questions, if you want to pop them into the chat, as Fred had mentioned, and Heshi will keep an eye on the chat for us. You can interrupt in the chat with questions at any time, and we'll see what we get to. For those who studied with me last time, you know that I have clearly brought an ambitious source sheet that we couldn't possibly get to all of. And so we're going to try, we're going to see where we get. And in the meantime, we're going to, I'm going to pop the link to that source sheet in front of you if you want to look at it as a Google Doc. We'll also be sharing screens throughout. So we're going to start, Fred, if you could just pop up slide 2. I'll just give a little overview of what I'm hoping for us to go over during today's session, which is that we're going to talk a little bit about the concept of pronouns and variety of gender. And then we're really going to dive into the Talmud's 6 categories for sex variation. And it's going to be a little slippery back and forth between the notions of sex and gender. You can go back to that second slide, Fred, that's totally okay. We're going to talk then about a figure, a character, a person, a human being from these texts who is known in the ancient past as the androgynos, and what it's like to live as an androgynos. And the last section that we'll hopefully get to is just the notion of blessing that comes out of all this. The texts that we're looking at today might feel difficult, they might feel alienating, they might feel welcoming, they might feel celebratory. No prescription on my part of how we might react to what we see. But what I'm really hoping to do is to move us kind of from present back into the past, into the embodied experiences of people whose genders were beyond or other than or different than or more varied than male and female, and to get us back into the notion of that variety today. There might be terms with which you're unfamiliar. That's okay. I talk fast, I make jokes. It doesn't mean that I don't want you to interrupt me and say that again. Or, well, but what did you really mean by that? And hey, I have a question. This is really about all of us coming together to understand how inclusion on the base of sex and gender and that variety might have related to our ancestors and how it relates to us today, and hopefully our descendants in the future, whether they be our biological descendants, our familial descendants, our chosen family descendants, or our spiritual and educational descendants. So I'm going to ask folks to read aloud. If there are folks who would volunteer, we're about to look at source 1. If there's someone who wants to just wave for me that you'd be willing to read aloud a text in English. I see Moshe's screen. So we're gonna share text source 1, what and why, from a website called mypronouns.org. And we'll hear Moshe's voice reading that. Thank you so much for volunteering. I'm gonna also pop the text itself into the chat so people can see it. Maybe I'm gonna do that. Okay. All right. I invite you, Moshe, to unmute yourself.
Yep. Often people make assumptions about the gender of another person based on the person's appearance or name. These assumptions aren't always correct, and the act of making an assumption, even if correct, sends a potential harmful message. I'll let someone else continue.
Thank you.
Hashi, do you see people holding their hands up?
I'll read.
Thank you.
That people have to look a certain way to demonstrate the gender that they are or are not. Until someone's correct personal pronouns is a way to respect them, using someone's correct personal pronouns is a way to respect them and create an inclusive environment. Just as using a person's name can be a way to respect them. Just as it can be offensive or even harassing to make up a nickname for someone and call them that nickname against their will, it can be offensive or harassing to guess at someone's pronouns and refer to them using those pronouns if that is not how that person wants to be known. Or worse, actively choosing to ignore the pronouns someone has stated that they go by could imply the oppressive notion that intersex, transgender, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people do not or should not exist.
So thank you so much to both Susan and to Moshe for reading. That's a real mouthful of a text with a lot of words in there that we may be familiar with and maybe are not familiar with. And so I'm gonna pop it into the chat there. And I'm gonna ask Fred if you can stop sharing, because now they can see the text also in the chat box, hopefully. If folks have questions about any of those particular words and what they mean, to just type that away in the chat. If that's not the way that you want to interact with this forum, you can also wave your hand or raise your hand to ask questions of clarification, just for some definitions that we might need to review or learn for the first time. So this notion of pronouns, I don't know, how many people feel like just basically terrified to mess up, since this text says like you could harm someone by just making an assumption? Yeah, like it's really scary, right? This is basically saying like stakes are high. And I really want to just say right off the bat that though I am a member of the LGBTQ community and I have a child who is non-binary, I make mistakes about this all the time. To my kid, in my work as a rabbi at NYU, there was a time when I was so proud of myself for using technology and sending an email to some people who had come to an LGBTQ affirming event. And each student had swiped in their little university ID, and it automatically populated my email with the person's first name. So they all got a personalized message from me. Thank you so much for being here. Can't wait to welcome you to the next Pride event. And just didn't even think about the fact that many transgender students, because they're young people and might not be out to their parents, use a name that's different than the name under which they're registered in college. And so students received just automatically a personalized email to the name under which they're registered, which for a trans student might be a name that reminds them of all the ways in which they are not seen as their true self. And so I sent out the email, so proud of myself. I immediately got a reply. I was like, well, students don't even check their emails anymore. I'm so excited. And the email said, Rabbi Nikki, you of all people should know better. And it was a student who was angry with me because I messed up. Now, was it my fault that when you swipe your ID in, the name that shows up is the name under which you're registered? Of course not. I didn't create the policy. Was it my responsibility to find out what would happen if I used that system to send the emails? Arguably, yes, was my responsibility to do that. But I did what many people might have done in that situation, which was I wrote a long email back, sort of apologizing in a very profuse way and explaining why I had messed up and how the system had failed me. And thank God I sent that email to my colleague at the LGBTQ Center at NYU. And he said, I really hear what you're saying in this email, and I hear that you're really concerned that you messed up. I'm going to hold your guilt and discomfort, but what you're going to do is delete those paragraphs from this email and not send them to the student, right? And the only part you're going to include is, I am sorry that I misgendered you. I thank you for being brave enough to tell me. And here's what I'm going to do to educate myself further to try to address this issue to ensure that other students don't face it again, right? Without promising that I had the power to like change the registrar system at a multi-global campus university. And then I did those things, right? So that's the invitation that we're giving to everyone today, right? There are words that we don't know. There are times we're going to mess up. And our ancestors have also struggled, right? We live in a world where you walk into a toy store and there's still kind of a boy aisle and a girl aisle, right? Or when you make a donation, for example, if there's a book drive, at the holidays, and we have a lot of issues with generalizations, right? In our culture, you might do a book drive and it'll say, pick up a book for a 7th grade boy, right? Or a 4th grade girl. But how do you know what this 7th grade boy or non-binary person or queer kid, right? How do you know what belongs in that category? And so I assure you that we're not the first people to struggle with them. That's what we're facing. So I want to ask if folks have reactions or questions to that text and the idea of pronouns, and or for those of you who I know are kind of already jumping onto the PRISM bandwagon of kind of knowing that this diversity already exists, are there places where it's hard in Jewish community to think about beyond men and women? Like, where are the times in Jewish community that it comes up that it matters if you are male or female? You can pop those responses into the chat. You might say, you know, this is a Reform community and there's no discrimination based on sex or gender, so it doesn't matter. Till you have to go to the bathroom. You have to pick. When you are called to the Torah, you are called to the Torah often as ben or bat, as son or daughter. There are some who might be, right, bar or bat mitzvah. When you go to the mikveh, the ritual bath, is a physically divided space. Affiliation groups, temple brotherhood, temple sisterhood, right? When you visit Jerusalem and you go to the Western Wall. I remember when I was in my year in Israel, it was Tisha B'Av. It was the date of the anniversary of the destruction of the temple. And we were told, when we get to the wall, you're going to hear these beautiful melodies for the book of Lamentations, the book of Eicha. You're going to hear Iraqi melodies. You're going to hear all these things. And I thought, we got there. And guess who didn't hear those melodies? Any of the people who were on the women's side. Because nobody is chanting on that side. So thanks for promising me an experience, right, that I was deprived of, right? And that was a rabbi, my teacher, who knew what it was going to be like, right? BBYO youth group, right? You might join particularly, and like, I'm not saying it's bad, right, that we join these groups or not, right? I'm just asking us to point to where are the places where we see sex or gender. Hebrew is a gendered language. A table has a gender in Hebrew. When we go to an Orthodox synagogue, we have to choose a side to stand on. There's a mechitza, a divider, right? A halfway point. We might at a wedding see a lot of gender, right? Jillian gets getting me started on my whole feelings about gender and equality and marriage contracts. Wow. Rosh Chodesh, the new month, the new moon, often seen as a women's holiday and a women's experience, right? And there are differences, right? For example, there are people who menstruate and people who don't, right? There are women who do not menstruate, perhaps because of their age in life, their hormonal balances, right? All those things. There are trans men who menstruate. I think one of the bravest people I knew was the college student who posted, oh, you know, that annoying thing when Rite Aid is not open for 24 hours and you really need some tampons. And it's a trans guy posting it. And I was just like, yes, you know, a reminder that bodies might be different. So Moshe, your question is sort of like getting me ahead of myself, which is that, you know, this is a challenge for some folks in Judaism, right? For some of us, we thought, well, for all this time, this is the way it is, and we'll just leave it that way, right? Hebrew is a gendered language. It says Melech HaOlam, king of the world. What are we going to do, right? There's lots of metaphors and things in the language that we have access to, first of all. So why not refer to God in broader ways? In Isaiah, God is like a mama bear. God is like a woman in labor who cries out. I mean, that's really different images. And there's a group now called the Non-Binary Hebrew Project, nonbinaryhebrew.org, that has actually created an entire grammatical system, if you're a grammar nerd like me, an entire grammatical system for both singular and plural non-binary, so neither male nor female options for Hebrew. And you could conjugate, I mean, you name it, they've figured it out. How to do the imperative command, everything is there. These are all things that are emerging, and we're going to talk a little bit about why they are emerging. Okay, so we've already identified lots of places where Judaism might need to expand the way that we approach ritual, congregational life, the space of the synagogue. And so we're going to look a little bit at these 6 categories. First, I'm just going to ask Fred to pop up a slide that just has them all kind of listed there. If you have thoughts and ideas about whether or how these might relate to actual categories of human beings that we relate to today, I invite you to think about that in your mind, pop it into the chat, take notes on your paper if you want to. So we're looking at slide 3, which is these 6 categories. I want to add also that I talk pretty frankly about sex and sexuality most of the time, though I was raised Catholic. It's like, maybe it's because I was raised Catholic that I like to go the other direction. I mean, not like slang or offensive terms, but frank terms. And the rabbis liked to talk in kind of veiled metaphors and euphemisms, right? The word for had sex with someone in the Torah, right? We're not going to see an Adam and Eve had sex. They're going to say, and he knew her. And lo, she became with child and gave birth to a son, and they called him Abel. So sort of similarly for these first 2 categories of sex, and these might be the first 2, the ones that we might be more familiar with, Zachar and Nekeva in the creation story, right? God creates a human being, Zachar and Nekeva. We talked about this story last time at Purim. What does it mean for human beings to have both one human created at first and then this differentiation? Zachar from a word that means a pointy sword, right? Maybe that's perhaps a metaphor for the phallus, right? The particular body part that might distinguish men from women, or the one that we seem to focus on. And nekeva for crevice or opening or passageway, which might refer to the vagina, the female sex organ. And then we have the androgynos, who we might argue is male and female, or neither, or both. 499 references in early rabbinic literature. So this is from the Midrash through the Shulchan Aruch. So from the first centuries of the Common Era all the way up into the 15th century. Not unknown, right? Not just men and women, male and female. The other categories are the tumtum. The tumtum was described as someone whose sex or sexual anatomy was obscured and indeterminate, but could be determined at some point in time, right? So this person was either male or female, but you couldn't tell at first, right? That's kind of the image. 697 references. An Ilonit is someone who was assigned female or assumed female at birth and in childhood, and at puberty begins to exhibit physical characteristics that folks would associate as male. And the Sari is kind of the reverse of that. Someone who is assigned or assumed male at birth and then starts to show female characteristics at puberty. All many, many references, right, to these different categories of people. So we're going to read a couple of sources to clarify, and then we're really going to unpack those back. And actually, if there's somebody who, or I'll type them in as we're reading the next text. So can I get someone who's willing to read our next text? If you could give a wave. There are a few Hebrew words transliterated in it. I promise we'll all not care about how they're pronounced. I see Luke's hands up. Yeah? Luke and Olivia. Okay, awesome. So we're going to share with you source 2. Thank you so much, Fred.
All right. Our rabbis taught, who is a Saris Chama? Any person gendered masculine grammatically through this passage who is 20 years of age and has not produced 2 heirs, or hairs. Heirs with a silent H, right?
Hair.
Oh, hairs, sorry.
Yeah. Hair, but different place in your body.
Okay, oh, right, sorry. I was thinking heirs and H-E-I-R.
Totally, right. We might, right. So this sexuality, reproduction, and biology, anatomy, right? We conflate those all the time. The rabbis are going to do that too.
Mm-hmm. And even if he produced them afterwards, he is deemed to be a saris in all respects. And these are his characteristics. He has no beard, his hair is lank, and his skin is smooth. Rabbi Shimon Beliezer said, he whose voice is defective or inadequate, so that no one cannot distinguish whether it, i.e. their voice, is that of a man or a woman.
And if you could continue, that would be great.
Sure. Who is an an Ayalonit. Any person gendered feminine grammatically throughout this passage who is 20 years of age and has not produced 2 hairs. And even if she produces them afterwards, she is deemed Ayalonit in all respects. And these are her characteristics. She has no breasts and suffers pain during copulation. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamaliel said, one who has a lower anatomy unlike other women. Rabbi Shimon ben Eliezer said, one whose voice is deep so that one cannot distinguish whether it, i.e., their voice, is that of a man or of a woman.
Okay. Thank you so much, Luke. These categories we're getting a little bit, the 2 of them at least, are being explained to us in a little bit more detail. Again, I'm going to try to pop these into the chat so we can see, or if Fred or Heshi could pop them into the chat, that would be great. And Fred, you can stop sharing the screen so I can see people's faces. What do we see in this text? If we wanted to pick out, is it talking about physical characteristics that we call sex? Is it talking about cultural or things you can choose that have to do with gender? Is there any ambiguity in those categories? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Are there things that you think are missing? How are we measuring up who is an Elonit and who is a Saris? What do we notice? I see a hand raised, John and Julius, a lot of physical characteristics, right? We're talking about external genitals, someone's voice.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that for the woman version or female version,
Yeah,
Elonit, they mentioned this idea of pain during copulation, which could, I mean, it's interesting in the sense of at the time, like thinking how copulation generally led to birth and, carrying on, the tribe, if you will. But then there's also perhaps this other point where having this idea that people that are having pain during copulation be forced to have it, or that be a part of who they are, I think there is something humane in the idea that it's understood that people may have physical characteristics that wouldn't align them to perhaps at the time a traditional role. So I think, it just feels like in some sense, like in the lens of where we are today, it may feel still somewhat out of touch. But if we look at for the time, there is an element that does feel pretty progressive in terms of what else you might see in the world when it was written.
Yeah, that's really interesting to think about, right? They're saying there is a variety, and what you're sort of, I think, pointing to here is then like, okay, so then what happens, right, to this person? Do they carry on behaving in a particular expected way, right? What do you do if you're an Elonit? Does anyone know one of the most famous characters in all of the Torah was considered an Elonit by the rabbis in the Midrash, and that's Sarah. That they sort of say that this is this one interpretation, that Sarah is an Elonit, and that explains her barrenness for the beginning of her life. Beginning of her adult life, right? And by beginning, I mean most of it, right? Like she doesn't have a baby until she's 90. And this miraculous turning around, right? In the similar tradition of the folks who kind of get the birthright being the underdog or the unexpected person, right? Not like David is not the person that you think who would be triumphant, right? So we've got more of a variety. Are these markers of maleness or femaleness, or the markers of, oh, maybe this person who we thought was female is male? Are they similar markers to ones that you would use in trying to figure gender identity? When we see people, do we try? We wonder what pronoun to use for them. What are the markers of characteristics that we look for in femininity or masculinity today? Anyone have a dress code in their school, either when they were growing up or now? No dress codes? Wow. Wow, y'all didn't go to Catholic school, huh? Some people are nodding their heads. Yeah. breasts, a defined waist, wearing a skirt. Which category is that?
Female.
Right. People will assume that that person is a woman.
Yeah.
Right. When Harry Styles wore, who's a singer, wore a skirt and a dress in Vogue, like people lost their minds. Right. I remember hearing a story about Barbara Boxer, Senator Barbara Boxer, the first time that she went onto the Senate floor as a senator, and she was wearing a pantsuit, and she walked out there, and a Senate page said to her, "Excuse me, miss, women are not allowed to wear pants on the Senate floor." And apparently she said, "Excuse me, I'm the senator, and I will wear what I please." Right? Or if folks who identify as men maybe went to a school where they had a rule where your hair had to be cut higher than your collar. Right? None of these shaggy Beatles haircuts. Right? What kind of gender message are you sending with long hair? A top and a bottom at Quaker school for that's really great, right? So we might have gendered expectations, we might not. We might have expectations about somebody's anatomical variety, right? So for folks who are familiar with the term intersex birth is really common, or more common than one might think. 1 in 2,000 human beings are born with what the medical community might characterize as ambiguous genitalia, or that they would be difficult to classify, right? So that moment of birth when you expect, or maybe like me, dread the doctor saying it's a boy or it's a girl, the doctor says, "Hold on a second, we have to take a closer look. What's going on here?" Might be a variety of chromosomal connections. Might be a variation on the size and appearance of someone's external genitalia. The doctors, I actually don't have an update on whether this is still what is done, but previously there was a determination that basically the doctors would measure a person's clitoris, penis, when they weren't sure which of these two things it was. And under a certain length, they would say this person is female, and over a certain length, they would say this person is male, right? Just an arbitrary decision of how many centimeters, right? And might operate actually on that infant with the consent of the parents, but certainly not of the infant, and might operate on the infant, but telling the parents, "Oh, there's a problem with the child's urinary function," right? When actually the surgery might be cosmetic to be able to classify a person as male or female, right? So this variety, we don't necessarily know what the rabbis knew about this variety, but we see, right, that there are already more than 2 terms, right? If it's 1 in 2,000 births now, then it was probably also common then, right? We're not so different from our ancestors. So we have already, there's an acknowledgement that there are more than 2 sexes. And Fred, if you would pop up slide 4, I'd love to get folks' reaction to just the ways in which we continue to see our sex, what we might call the physical combinations, right? Your hormones. Anyone? I don't know. You don't have to share, but I know that many folks who are women or female might experience later in life growing hair on your face after your period stops, or if you were like me and you were young and people didn't start developing early, or did, and who needs to wear a bra and who doesn't, right? There's a variation even over our lifetime that might affect the way that we think about the way that we present gender-wise, right? I present a very particular way gender-wise. I always wear dresses, I'm wearing makeup. Doesn't necessarily mean that I'm a woman. In this case, I am. But we've got these 3 sort of categories that folks often conflate, and I think Judaism often conflates them too. That sex, someone who's male, female, non-binary, intersex, or those 6 categories we might put also under here, does that lead onto a particular gender expression, right? In Judaism, there are some expectations, at least fashion-wise, of being able to see someone's gender on the outside. What might those be? Anything you wear, maybe different because we're talking about the Reform community.
The kippot and the tzitzis.
Right. There's a mandate, a mitzvah that men wear a head covering, that they have tzitzit, that they have peyot, that they don't cut the locks on the sides of their heads. You could tell by looking at someone, right, which category they belong to. Wearing to fill in the box with the scroll inside on your forehead and on your arms in the mornings. You might also, in some communities, know someone's marital status, right? If they are a woman wearing a headscarf or a covering or a wig, right? You might know not only that person's gender and maybe sex, right? Or assume that you know, but also how they relate to desire. Oh, they must be straight and married, right? A man who wears a tallit in some communities is only someone who's married. You know, he's old enough to wear that particular garment. So we think about the ways that sex, gender, and desire have been connected together. And the question is going to be, what happens if you don't fall into the category of male or female? How do we think about your sex, your gender, your desire, and like, what do you do in the world? So Fred, let's pop up. Actually, let's just pause a minute for questions, reactions before I move us to the actual people in the ancient time period who fit into these categories, or the category of androgynous in particular. Cecile, did I pronounce that correctly?
Yes, you did. Good evening. Thank you so much
Hi.
for being with us tonight. I have a question for you. I hear you use interchangeably the word sex and the word gender.
Yep.
Traditionally, what I've heard is sex is when we talk about the biological, which we just started talking about, and gender more as the identification of one person to one of the categories. So I was wondering, I'm sure there's a reason why you do that.
Yeah, why do I do that? I mean, partly I do that because I think that there's been a trend, an increasing trend to say sex is physical and biological, and therefore that means it's totally binary and predictable and fixed. There's only two options, right? It's often used as a conservativizing impulse against variety. If you love science, I can't say that I'm not anti-science, but I was not a good science student. Clearly, language was my thing. But there's an amazing book called Evolution's Rainbow. And it's actually written by a trans evolutionary biologist. And she's got some really, really interesting ideas. But one of her arguments is we have imposed our cultural notions of gender onto the supposed scientific, objective notion of sex. We look at, for example, male and female birds, and we say, oh, look, there are three birds raising young in this particular nest. And so one of those men was cuckolded by that female bird who brought in another male. Right? What does cuckolded mean? I mean, do birds take a vow of sexual fidelity and then they cheated and you broke your breed, you broke your covenant? And so you say, right, instead of saying, let's look at how this species of birds both creates, reproduces, and raises young. This species of birds have 3-parent households. That's just what they do. Right? Instead of pitting it as a competition. It's really a challenging notion, right? It's really a challenging notion. Even if we look at the Torah, right, we have stories of families that look different from what a family might be expected to look like. Even thinking of the story of Ruth and Naomi, right, who basically raise a child together. Naomi kind of, like the baby that's born at the end, right, counts as both Ruth's child and Naomi's child. Look, Naomi, you were bitter before, and now look at this pleasantness and this blessing that is in your life. That's the biological child of her daughter-in-law with her distant relative. Like, how does that baby count for her? Because emotionally and spiritually, right, that's her family. So I think, for me, I would love to just say sex is biology and gender is culture, but I don't want that to make us think that it means that biology and science are actually objective. We see what we look for in the first place. I remember and also that it's not going to protect us. In the 90s, when I was in college, everyone was talking about the gay penguin. Gay rights are guaranteed now because there's a gay penguin at the Central Park Zoo. Gay is natural. 2 dad penguins are raising a baby together. Jerry Falwell did not care that gay penguins existed, conservative pundit, right? It was, well, if it's biological, then why don't we figure out a way to isolate the gene that makes people gay and choose to exclude it? Right? Telling us it's natural, right, doesn't help. I think for me, the wisdom of Jewish tradition is that every time we see a binary, there's day and there's night. Is there just, I mean, anyone see like a probably in a Tom and Jerry cartoon, right? There's like a sun with a smiley face on it, and then it goes whoop down right away, and then here comes the sleepy moon. Is that how it happens? When day turns to night, it's totally a gradation. And there's this twilight and there's dusk. And the rabbis spend, I don't even know how many pages of Talmud saying, how do you know when it's time to recite the evening Shema? How do you know when it's time to recite the morning Shema? Well, is it when the sky is this color? And if the blue thread is seen as blue, what have you, right? They want to know about the in-betweens. We have these categories and boundaries as a guideline, but we want to know about what's in between. So that's why I use them in a pushing around way, because I think it can be easy to assume that what I'm saying is there are two sexes, and then we put clothes on top of that, and those are the genders, right? Gender is how long my hair is, right? Gender might depend on, for those of you who, like me, change your weight changes over the course of your life, maybe frequently, and maybe you're in a category that some people would call overweight. And there are some days when you walk into a room and you might be seen as attractive or sexually appealing, and other days when people might as well not see you at all, right? There might be, I cannot tell you, I've never worn a dress that was the right length as a rabbi. Rabbi, your skirt is too long, it's so dowdy. Rabbi, you wearing such a short skirt, right? That might have to do with my body type, my profession, my age or my perceived age. I'm sure that I know that my perceived age is younger, right? It might be the same for someone who is a man or identified by other people as a man. I'm thinking about my college students and the sweet guys who are walking on campus, and maybe it's night and they're scared. And they see an acquaintance who's a woman across the quad, and they want to go across the quad to walk next to her. And they realize, oh, as I walk toward her, she's afraid of me. And now she's walking faster, right? It's really complicated, and I think it harms all of us. So, and I think I'd love to take a peek at slide 5. I just want to read for us somebody who was harmed by the restriction of the categories of male and female. His name is Kalonimos ben Kalonimos. And we might hear in this story folks that we know. So 13th century France, this translation is by Rabbi Stephen Greenberg, who is an out gay rabbi in the Orthodox community, the open Orthodox community now. And Kalonimos writes, oh, but had the artisan who made me created me instead a fair woman. And when I was ready and the time was right, an excellent young man would be my fortune. He would love me, place me on a pedestal, dress me in jewels of gold, earrings, bracelets, necklaces, and on the appointed day in the season of joy when brides are wed, for 7 days the youth would increase my delight and gladness. Father in heaven, who did miracles for our ancestors with fire and water, you changed the sea to dry land. In the desert you turned rock to water, hard flint to a fountain. Who would then turn me from man to woman? So this turn that I want to take us to, and you can stop the share, Fred, even though it's really beautiful to see Kalonimos' words, is that sometimes when we look at these 6 categories in the Talmud for sex, folks will argue, these 6 categories exist because the rabbi's favorite thing to do was find the limit of the law and try to test it. And so they would make up a case where they could test it. And so maybe that's what the rabbis were doing. They were making up these cases so they could see how it would apply, right? But I think that that's just not true. It can't possibly be true if the biological and cultural variety that we see in sex and gender and the way that relationships are formed, right? The love of David for Jonathan, whether sexual or not, crossed a lot of boundaries. The love of Abraham and Sarah in their old age, right? That there's much more beyond that. We need to think about the people themselves. So we're going to look at a text about the androgynos that is about law, And what we're going to listen for, besides like what are these people allowed to do and not allowed to do according to Jewish law, is what would you do if you identify as or identified by others as an androgynous? What do you do every day, Jewishly? When you wake up in the morning, what's your life like? Okay, so if we could share that text, that actually before that, anyone want to raise their hand to volunteer to read? Thank you, Jessica. Okay, and so we're going to look at source 3. This is a source from the Mishnah, so this is like one of the earliest layers of figuring out how to apply Torah into everyday laws. Some folks think that this is actually a later addition to the Mishnah. There's an argument of the actual date of the text, but this is a Mishnah about offerings, chapter 4. And Jessica, if you could take it away, that would be great.
Sure. An androgynous is similar to men in some ways and to women in other ways, in some ways to both and in some ways to neither. In what ways are they similar to men? Like a man, they are considered impure through semen. They dress and cut their hair like a man. They marry others and are not married off like a man, and are obliged to perform all the commandments in the Torah like a man. In what ways are they similar to women? They cause ritual impurity with red discharge like women, and must not be secluded with men like women. At their birth, their mother counts the blood of her impurity like when giving birth to a girl, and they are disqualified from being a witness like women. Rabbi Meir says an androgynous is a created being of their own. The sages could not decide if they are a man or a woman, but this is not true of a tumtum, who is sometimes a man and sometimes a woman.
Thank you so much. And if we could get that text popped into the chat too, that would be awesome. So we have, and you can stop your share too. Sorry, Fred. Fred is like the greatest. It's like 1,000. I'm like, could I just give you everything in one document? No, I have to give you 3 different slides and then, okay. So what do we notice about the laws that the androgynous has to worry about following? Anyone want to just notice anything that might sound difficult or easy to follow? What is this person's daily life like? I'm gonna also take a peek at I'm gonna put the middle section especially in the chat, because that's the one that's, so we learned sometimes they're similar to men, in some ways similar to women, sometimes both, sometimes neither. I didn't include the whole paragraph on both and neither. The both is sort of like, they are a human being. So if you kill them, that's bad, right? Created in the image of God, which, maybe is the minimum that we want to admit about LGBTQ folks. It sort of bothers me actually that every time you hear about inclusion in the LGBTQ or for LGBTQ folks, people will often say, oh, the text that we can use to talk about this is we are all created b'tselem Elohim in God's image. And I'm thinking that's the first foundational one that should sort of go without saying. There's lots of other texts actually that support our robust inclusion. Okay, so Luke and Olivia are arguing the androgynous has to follow strict laws for both genders. So like, how do you do that? Anyone notice other things about these laws, or you have responses to them or questions about what they mean? Yes, Cecile, and then I see John and Julius.
What does it mean? Must not be secluded with men. It means they can't go to the side of men, for instance, in the synagogue.
So secluded with is the root there is yichud, being alone with. Why is it that there would be a law saying that a woman cannot be alone with a man? What's that law about?
Desire. Desire.
Desire. Whose desire?
Big question.
Great. We don't know, right? There's something going on, right? A man and a woman alone together, unattended property. I like this. I like the healthy skepticism of Jillian about the rabbi's motives, right? Somebody's sexual status matters a lot more than the other person's sexual status in a marriage. Anyone seen or have a traditional a traditional ketubah, your marriage contract. The man is listed so-and-so, Ben so-and-so, right? His name, the son of his father's name. And the woman is listed with an additional word next to her name. And that word is either betulta, a virgin, or she is listed as a divorcee, a widow. What's the other? My favorite category, a convert. And that is her sexual status included in the ketubah, where his sexual status is not included in the ketubah. Now, we might argue that that is because the woman's sexual status affected her in different ways than the men's sexual status did, right? The rules were stricter. I'm not poo-pooing orthodoxy or ketubas or any of those things. I'm saying that there are underlying assumptions, right, about sex, sexuality, gender that lead to these different laws, right? A ketubah was actually a document intended to protect women who were otherwise vulnerable, right, in this economic system, economic and familial system. But this idea that you're not supposed to covet another man's wife. Now, why is it okay for a man to be alone with a man, secluded, like just two dudes in a room together by themselves? Why is that okay? They're definitely not going to have sex. Why would they have sex? It's two dudes. Right, there's an amazing text, and now I can't remember the placement of this text in the Talmud. I can look it up for folks if you want to know at the end, where the rabbis are talking about the commandment for a man not to lie with another man, the way that he might lie with a woman. And there was a section of the Talmud where they're talking about what happens when two Torah scholars travel together. And they get to an inn, and like there's only one place for them to sleep. And maybe they only brought one cloak with them that they would use as their blanket at night. Can they both sleep under one cloak? Right? And one rabbi says, no, of course they can't. And the other rabbis say, yes, because Jewish folks are not suspected of violating that text in Leviticus that says a man should not lie with another man. We just don't do that, right? But when a woman and a man are alone together, the assumption is that there might be sex and sexuality present, or inappropriate sexuality present, right? You can only be secluded with your wife. Yichud is the first thing that often a married couple will do after they leave their chuppah, which I argue is great, not just for the purposes of the traditional purpose, but just to have a minute alone on the day of your wedding without all the people and the guests and the parents, right? But this notion that the androgynos, right, is treated like a man in a lot of ways. He can marry a woman. What is it? Why does it say he marries but is not married off? Anyone want to guess what that's about?
Well, he has a choice.
There's a choice. Married off is when you're given away.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There's an active voice and a passive voice in the text. A man actively marries, a woman is married. Passive grammar nerd. Thank you, Sister Nihilus, St. Clement's School, 5th grade. Right. He owns himself, right? He doesn't have to be acquired by someone. And there is this notion that the androgynous, first of all, we have a teacher in our community, Rabbi Elliot Kukla. Rabbi Elliot Kukla is the one who counted up all those references to all those 6 categories. Rabbi Kukla is one of the 2 first out trans rabbis ordained in the Reform movement. He actually was my first Hebrew teacher, by, I'm sure not a coincidence, by Hashem. It was this is the person you need to teach you Hebrew. So maybe, right? Maybe I love this comment. Maybe the rabbis didn't view sex between 2 men in the same way that they viewed sex between men and women. I don't think we looked together last time at one of my favorite texts, which is that the rabbis in Leviticus, the Torah in Leviticus says a man should not lie with another man. Once my wife and I were in Washington, D.C., where we lived, and we were holding hands on the escalator leaving the subway, and a woman yelled at us, Leviticus 18:22. Just screaming at us, Leviticus 18:22. And it felt really threatening at the time, actually. And then I thought, I've read Leviticus 18:22, and it doesn't say anything about women or lesbians. So keep walking, right? Just, and nobody ever yells, Deuteronomy 23, whatever you shall not wear a garment that has 2 different kinds of threads in it, right? Nobody yells that at me on the street, right? They yell Leviticus 18:22. And Rashi says, if you were wondering why women are not punished for homosexual behavior, let me assure you, he calls women who have sex with women nashim mesololot, women who rub up against other women. He says this is not a capital offense, but it is prohibited. It is the doings of Egypt. It's acting like the Egyptians. And it should involve a punishment of lashings, but not a punishment of death. And why is it only a punishment of lashings? Because he says, Ein biapo, there is no intercourse. There's no sex. Sex is penetration. There's no, I mean, I don't even know if maybe Rashi is like, if you've ever seen the amazing classic movie, If These Walls Could Talk. The first one is about abortion access and rights. And the second one is about lesbian relationships. And I think Rashi might have choreographed the sex scenes in that movie because it's just mysterious what these two people are doing with each other. They just can't imagine. They can't imagine that it's sex, right? They have no idea what's going on. And maybe there was, right, a view differently. If anyone's ever heard, a sort of stereotype of young folks in relationships, that a boyfriend would hear that his girlfriend was bisexual and be super psyched about it. Awesome, 2 women, cool. But if a girl hears that her boyfriend is bisexual, people are like, you should break up with him, he's gay. Right? That double standard that happens. Rashi definitely didn't understand what was going on between 2 women. But poor Rashi, he didn't get married until he was pretty older for his generation. So we've got this notion that the androgynous is actively marrying a woman like a man might, and yet that same guy after his wedding can't go have a drink with his bro, right, his best man, alone at the bar, because now suddenly the androgynous might be a woman, right? I see Olivia and Luke, your hands up, please.
Hi, I'm sorry, this is this is neither here nor there, but we were just kind of curious. Do you know why with androgynous, it's the Greek word?
Yes, so anyone familiar with Plato's story of the creation of human beings and the origin of desire? Anyone familiar with I love when I get to introduce this to people. Anyone familiar with the film Hedwig and the Angry Inch?
Sure.
Or the Broadway musical? Don't look it up if
yeah,
you don't like racy or explicit things, but it is definitely a controversial show for some folks, but there's a beautiful song in it called The Origin of Love. This text with the androgynous, in the Hebrew text, when you look at it, it says androgynous. And it's like if you're ever looking and reading in Hebrew and you get to I remember getting to a word I couldn't pronounce and being like, what is the root of this? And it's like a tet and a resh, and the word was Toronto, right? You get to this word androgynous and you're trying to look it up in the dictionary and you realize it is a Greek word transliterated into Hebrew, right? So there's a cross-cultural influence that the Greeks had this notion that folks might interpret as a hermaphrodite. Androgynous now, right? When we think of androgynous, we might think of, I don't know, Grace Jones or Mick Jagger. We might think of a person whose outward appearances are kind of neither male nor female classifiable. Even the definition of that changes over time, right? Because you think about Barbara Boxer wearing pants, right? Might have been considered androgynous in the past with her long hair. But the word comes from Greek, so the rabbis are influenced, right, by this category, and they take that category up and say, actually, this makes sense to us, right? This is a variety with which we are familiar in human beings, right? But how would you live your life if it can never be determined if you're male or female, if everything you do when you wake up in the morning is determined by which one you say yes to? Am I a man? Yes. Okay, put on your fringed garment and say the blessing. There are some who say that androgynous should put on the fringed garment, but not say the bracha, just in case they weren't commanded to put it on. Now imagine you're a young person who just reached bar mitzvah and you're putting your tzitzit on every day, and you watch your friend in the next bunk at camp put on his or their tzitzit, and they don't say the blessing. You're like, you're supposed to say the blessing. Why aren't you saying the blessing? Right? And then what does the androgynous say? Oh, I'm an androgynous, so I actually don't say the blessing because I'm not really sure if I'm a man and if I should wear these tzitzit. Right? There's a real difficulty then and a disconnect for the person. And so it's always been really interesting to me, even to look at the way our reform movement talks about trans and non-binary folk, right? Folks who believe that, or who know that their gender is outside of, beyond, different than male or female. So an example is there was a, how many people are not familiar with the term responsa literature or Shelo Tshuvot, if you're not familiar? So this is a kind of literature where a person or a community would ask a question of a rabbi to get an answer back. Sheila is the question and the tshuva is the response. And they would say, you know, okay, so I don't know, like an early 20th century one might be, the rabbis of the Talmud say we're not supposed to do certain things on Shabbat, but somebody just invented this thing called the elevator. Hey, rabbi, can we use the elevator on Shabbat or not, right? And then the rabbi replies with a letter that cites all the different cases in Jewish law from the Talmud to support his position. Yes, you can use it. No, you can't, right? And so some of these questions that we ask them today in the Reform movement. So even though we are not a movement that is bound by Jewish law, we still engage with Jewish law. And a question that came up, I think it's 2014, this responsum was, imagine a couple that when they got married, the assumption was that one of them was a man and one of them was a woman, and they had a straight marriage. Then the presumed husband says, you know what, actually, I'm a trans woman. The couple decides to stay together. The Reform movement is totally cool with gay marriage by the time this responsa is written. And in fact, I think it's post gay marriage being legalized in the US. So there's no legal, civil problem, and there's no spiritual problem in the Jewish community to them staying married. And the question the rabbi asks is, do they need to write a new ketubah, a new marriage contract? And I have amazing respect for my colleagues on this committee. The responsum is all about whether this person is still legally, Jewish legally the same person, and whether it's valid to write a new ketubah where all the dates would be wrong, right? They already got married. They're not getting married the day that you rewrite it. And can you backdate it and sign it, or is that lying, right? The question they don't ask is, I think, arguably the only question that matters, which is, does this couple emotionally and spiritually need a new ketubah? What does it feel like to that partner and her spouse to look at a document, right, that names her in a way with which she does not identify anymore and might be painful, right? Maybe it represents years and years and years of struggling to come out to people, right? Maybe it represents years and years and years of them negotiating their identity together as a couple, and the amazing decision to stay together, right? But we don't ask that question, how is a person living their life, right? We say, well, there are borders and boundaries in the law, and so like, which one do we have to pay attention to, right? But in the book of Leviticus in the Torah, it also says, you should obey my laws, that you should live by them. Mm. So how is the androgynos going to live by these laws? It's the question of walking into the synagogue and saying, I really need to use the bathroom, and I don't know which door to walk in, right? And the question is, what is our responsibility as a Jewish community? And again, I don't want to badmouth Orthodoxy. In fact, I think that many of my colleagues and friends in the Orthodox community are having an even more difficult time with this question, right? Because they are following Jewish law in a particular way. And I see the acknowledgement of the pain of having to say to someone, well, you just need to pick a side to sit on, or we actually don't have a mikveh for you to use for your conversion, right? It's not an easy conversation, but I think it's the one that we are moving toward having. So I just want to ask for more reactions to this. Anything that is coming up for folks that you want to share or ask? Yes. Moshe's window.
What do you do with a prayer that says, thank God that you didn't make me a woman?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for just handing me like just like a pedestal
You're
to stand on
welcome.
and say, yeah, yes, toda rabba. That there's a prayer in the traditional prayer book, in many prayer books today, that men are asked to recite, thank you for not making me a woman. Actually really parallel to a Greek notion of the time. So imagine the rabbis in this sort of Hellenist world. There's Romans who are just like, venerating ancient Greece. Greece really loved to poo-poo on women, fun times, on children, and on so-called barbarians, anyone who lived outside their polis, their city, their political unit. We don't want to be like those people. Guess who some of those outsiders were? Jewish people, right? And the Jews are responding and writing our own prayers and blessings and insiders and outsiders, right? And you had three, the so-called three identity blessings. There's a great article about this by Joel Hoffman. The three identity blessings are: thank you, God, for not making me a slave, for not making me a Gentile, for not making me a woman. What do we do with those prayers? In the Orthodox prayer book, we have, and why don't we want to, why is someone grateful? Why is a Jewish man of that time grateful to not be a slave, a non-Jew, or a woman?
I think in all cases, life is easier.
There's an autonomy there.
Back then, yeah.
Yeah. There's a notion also of responsibility. In all cases, you can't pray. Those three categories are people who are not obligated. They are no time or gender. They are patur. They are exempt from, where men are chayav. Men are obligated to fulfill particular commandments, right? And anyone who has school-age children should know that sometimes when you are raising children, for example, you can't be in two places at once, and you 100% have to put your attention on those children, right? So the assumption is women are taking care of children. They have a master actually at home, their husband, who is their Baal. Word means literally master in Hebrew. The slave obviously has a master, right? And the non-Jew doesn't have the most important master, which is God, right? So there's sort of, we can see the sort of negative exclusionary aspects to that, but also the immense, and I think really admirable from a queer perspective, pride of a Jewish man saying, thank you for not making me like those other people, because I actually like being Jewish, right? It's unfortunate that there's these other categories of people within the Jewish community, like 51% of the population, right? Yeah, why does it, if we know that these folks exist and there are 6 categories, why do we make it so difficult, right? We have this notion culturally of sex and gender and desire fitting a certain way. And androgynous messes that up. It's so unpredictable. The rabbis are like, we can't figure it out. And they're just like, oh, it's like Twilight all the time, right? There's still a morning Shema and an evening Shema, and they have to tell you what to do and when to say it, right? I think, honestly, if you want to ask me why Judaism makes it so difficult, I think it's because the androgynous was never at the table making the decisions about these laws. The androgynous was not in the room to have their opinion, majority or minority, preserved in the Talmud, right? To say that, even, thinking about so-called like homosexuality, whatever word you want to use for queer sex, right? The fact that one of very few texts in the Talmud that takes on that verse in Leviticus says Jews are not suspected of that. Like baloney. If Jewish people never engaged in homosexual sex, there wouldn't be a law against it in Leviticus, right? You don't put up a stop sign, right, where nobody's running through the intersection, right? You make a rule because you needed the boundary there for some reason, right? And again, I'm a Reform rabbi, ex-Catholic, and I think that God gave us a Torah that we could read with our human brains. And our human brains are imperfect. The 6 categories of sex are not well known. You hang out in yeshiva and maybe you talk about that, but tractate, Nashim, a Seder Nashim, the entire order of books about women is plentiful, right? Mishnah Bikurim 4 is tiny and contested. Maybe it's in the original text and maybe it was added on later. Right? We don't teach these things to our young folks. What if we did? Right? What if we did? What if we said, hey, the rabbis knew that there were more categories? Right? I learned a lot from lots of different sources. If anyone's ever done Strengths Quest on a job or like a work team, it helps you figure out what your kind of top strengths are so you can see how you work best on a team. And my top strength, actually, yeah, I think it's my top, even above empathy, which I was very sad wasn't my top strength, was input. Meaning I like to take information from lots of sources and I consider them all valuable, right? This idea that if we, as the Talmud, I mean, if we studied, right? If we studied in Hebrew school, not just, all right, well, it came out to be, right? There's a section of the Talmud where there's these two students and they go to hear a Devar Torah, and the Devar Torah is about the multiplicity of the words of Torah. It's like, hitting an anvil with a metal hammer and there's all these sparks. And one of the students' responses is like, I can't possibly study Torah in a time like this. There's too many opinions. I don't want so many opinions, right? And it's true that at some point someone had to say, you're going to Home Depot to buy supplies for your sukkah. Here's exactly how much stuff you need, right? It needs to be this tall, minimal. It needs to be this wide. It needs to have this, right? Because otherwise you'd make yourself crazy trying to figure out what to put in your cart, right? You have to have boundaries in a decision. But we lose, right? When we only go to what's the bottom line, we lose all of that variety that's in the text. And the people who are harmed by that variety, right, are like Kalanimos ben Kalanimos, right? Who is crying to God saying, couldn't I have been a woman? Like, you did miracles where you turned a rock into water, right? That's two real different things. I mean, we might say men are from Mars and women are from Venus, but like, we're all humans, right? I don't think that I'm as different from a man as a rock is from water, right? And this really pleading. Can I explain how the text was changed from man shall not lie with boy to man shall not lie with man? So the text says the et zachar lo tishkav, and a male you shall not bed or lie down with, have sex with. As one lies with a female. I think that the part about men versus boys actually is a Greek convention that in ancient Greeks, and I say this as someone who did queer studies and did lots of academic classes on the history of sexuality, not as the rabbi hat on, the academia hat on, which is that in the Greek system, what was important in a sexual relationship was a power differential. Right? There was a hierarchical power differential between man and woman, and so they could have sex, and between a man and a boy, or an adolescent, or a just post-pubescent boy, and so he could have sex with the younger person. And also the grown man had to be the active partner, so-called, in penetrating the younger partner. But you could not have two equals have sex, right? In the Reform movement, God willing, anyone who is having sex are considering the other person equal to them. Right? Maybe not like, equal as in you think you're the same as each other. One could be swapped out for the other, right? We don't mean equivalence in that way, but that deserving of equal respect. There's not a hierarchy that has to endure between the two of you. How is God's promise to be numerous as the sands of the sea and the stars in the sky reconciled with people who don't procreate? So now this is one of my favorite I just feel like, Moshe, you're like handing me all my favorite research questions that I've like spent all of my rabbinical school time on. There's this figure in the Talmud named Shimon ben Azai. And Ben Azai says, Peru uravu, be fruitful and now first of all, be fruitful and multiply is already a metaphor. Okay, make fruit and make a lot. It doesn't say have sex and biologically reproduce. Now, obviously, that's the simple reading of the text. Be fruitful and multiply. You shouldn't just we had Adam and Eve and then nobody else ever after that, right? It's an origin story for why we would have children, which sometimes you need to remind yourself of in a pandemic when you've been 24/7 with your children for 18 months. There's an origin story for why we reproduce, right? Be fruitful and multiply, but already a metaphor, right? We might argue that there are teachers in many communities who do not have biological or adoptive or foster children who have been fruitful and multiplied. right? Not all the rabbis want us to read metaphorically. One rabbi who didn't necessarily want to read metaphorically was Shimon ben Azai, and he says, Peru u'revu, be fruitful and multiply, is so important. Because if you break that commandment, it is as if you diminished God's image in the world, because every person is made in the image of God, and you caused fewer images of God to be created in the world, and it is as if you murdered somebody. So he's like, double whammy, it's really bad. And you know what his students say to him? They say, you talk a good game, Ben Azai. I notice that you're not married and you have no children. And he says, Ma eseh, what am I supposed to do? Nafshi chashka b'Torah, my soul lusts for Torah. So we have already in the Talmud, be fruitful and multiply. But here's a guy who studies Talmud all day, says it's important, but doesn't have kids, and says, I'm different. I have a lot of passion and drive, but my passion and drive is for studying Torah in the world. And I don't have time and energy. I only have a bucket full of passion. I can spend it on women and procreation, or I can spend it on studying Torah. I'm spending all mine on studying Torah. Moshe, Rabbeinu, not the other Moshe, not this Moshe, but Moshe Rabbeinu, our teacher Moses, the rabbis of the earliest interpretations of the Torah think he might have done the same thing. There's a story that says that the reason Miriam was upset with Moses about his wife, Zipporah, the non-Israelite woman, was not that she was not Israelite, but that Miriam noticed that Zipporah had stopped wearing jewelry and putting on makeup. And she went to Moses' wife and said, why aren't you wearing jewelry and putting on makeup anymore? And she said, well, my husband's not interested in having sex with me anymore. He's always on the mountain with God. And Miriam goes to Moses and says, you are neglecting your wife, and that's why she's angry with him. And this is Numbers chapter 12, if you want to, that story. It doesn't mention it in Numbers chapter 12, but the Midrash does, right? The idea that Moses had too much energy, right, spent on his spiritual endeavors. He just didn't have time and energy for this other one. So, we say be fruitful and multiply. There's also this commandment not a commandment, but the idea that woman, and we talked about this together at Purim, I think, that a woman or a wife is ezer kenegdo, a helpmeet or a companion to him, right? Someone who's like your other half that balances you out. And there's a wonderful Rabbi, the Bach, who says after the Shulchan Aruch is written, so he's like, I guess, like 1700s, and he says, I'm not good at the history part. He says, but I'll tell you what he says. He says, it says you're supposed to have a helpmeet opposite you. Don't think that's your study partner, who's a guy. Oh, no, you can't have that kind of that emotional bond does not substitute for sex with a woman and being fruitful and multiply. But there's an argument about it, right? And there's an argument about it because people have felt the feelings that we feel and the sex that we've had with the people that we've had sex with. We didn't invent those things, much as we might think to, right? We're not the first person, thank God, who ever felt them. Our ancestors felt and experienced the things that we felt and experienced. And so there's always been this push and pull. And I think, there are lots of people who will say, it's unnatural. Gay folks are unnatural because they can't have children. And then someone might argue back, well, like my wife and I have children, right? And so therefore we're okay. I actually think personally that people who don't have children are also okay, right? That's also okay. And how do we reconcile that? Well, I think about the be fruitful and multiply commandment. And there are those who say, well, what if a man wants to marry a woman and he knows that she is barren, that she's infertile and she can't have children? They say, well, preferably he should have already had at least 2 children by his previous wife, so he's fulfilled his obligation, but he's not prevented from marrying her. The rabbis don't say after a woman is postmenopausal and couldn't possibly give birth unless she's Sarah and God shows up and does some miracles. The rabbis don't say stop having sex with your wife after that. Because now what's the point of sex, right? Because there's more than one point of sex in Judaism too, right? And I know that it maybe feels to folks that we've gotten far afield of the 6 sexes, but the reason, right, that we end up talking about sexuality is because when we think about sex, right, whatever cultural context we're into, often there's a prediction about our gender and there's a prediction about our sexuality, right? You might have been in a bris where someone's like, oh, this kid's gonna be a real lady killer someday. I'm like, first of all, if anyone said that at my kids' naming ceremonies, it would be, why were they invited? Why lady killer? Why is this the metaphor we want to give? Also, it's a baby, right? This person is an infant, and we're thinking about the sexuality of that child, right, immediately. It's so strange to me. It's strange to me as someone who, folks would say, oh, like, how are you going to teach your kids, like, they're like about gay people and stuff? And I'm like, it's just going to be part of their life. I'm not having sex in front of them any more than my parents, thank God, were not having sex in front of me, right? They didn't learn something inappropriate for their age or developmentally ahead of their time, but they knew something about sexuality that was more expansive, and that made people nervous. But we teach children and people of all ages about sex and sexuality all the time, right? We teach older people that they don't have sexuality, right? We just decide you're done. Anyone has ever seen the Tina Fey sketch about this, about at what point women are not desirable anymore in Hollywood? Hollywood is like 32, right? That we teach people that they're, and then you go, if you, like me, work at a nursing home, you will see a rich sexuality of people in that nursing home and hear a lot of gossip about it as well, right? And that is because people are human beings, right? From when we're born until we die. That's, we were created here to be temporary. I feel like I'm just talking at you now. With the joy of having questions that open up my favorite topics. So I want to leave people some chances to react, or any other burning questions you want to ask. I did meet the expectation that we wouldn't look at the whole source sheet. Yeah. So I'll say one more thing, which is that, part of the joy of looking at these texts is thinking about when and how we might introduce them to people in our communities at any point in our life cycle for any reason, whether we think that person might be gay or trans or not, right? It isn't that you talk about the androgynous with the person whose gender you can't identify looking at them, right? But that maybe when you study the story of creation, this is part of the conversation at weekly Torah study, at Hebrew school, from the Bima, whatever it is. And so one of the things that is happening now is really the multiplication of a variety of things like the non-binary Hebrew Project for Language, but all of the rituals that we might create for folks. And if you take the source sheet with you, please, you'll see part of an interview with a student named Noah, who was my student at NYU, and we together created a ritual for them to take a new name as they were publicly identifying as non-binary and using they, them pronouns. And we made a Jewish ritual of that moment, right, to which the whole community of students at NYU were invited. That's becoming more and more common, including actually a naming ritual that is in the published Rabbi's manual that Reform rabbis use, right? So when we look through that Rabbi's manual, it's like, here are all the rituals with birth and welcoming a baby, and coming of age and getting married and death and illness. There's a section on communal celebrations, and one of them is an adult renaming ceremony, right? And it might be for lots of reasons. Maybe you never received a Hebrew name when you were young and you want to take one on, or maybe the name doesn't match your gender and you want to take on one that does. So all of the ways in which we can be creative in these ways. So I want to just offer to folks that what was your response? I'm gonna, maybe we can answer some questions offline. I'm gonna leave my email in here. Oops, private messaged it to someone instead of someone. So this is my email, and Rav Nikki D is my handle on Instagram. If you want to follow me on Instagram, I have been doing some Wednesday morning prayer experiences together, and hopefully putting together a class on sex and sexuality coming up soon if you want to sign up. And you can ask me any questions there too. I think that when we want to affirm those in our communities who are LGBT and Q, a thing to remember is that for some of us, it's really painful. And the vulnerability can be really a lot. And the expectation, I love educating, but for some of us, the expectation to be always answering people's questions and educating them and helping other people can be really exhausting. And so I think, really looking at resources, and again, if you want more, I'm happy to share some via email or on my Insta. I share folks' names and other people to follow and learn from. That really learning from those of us who step out and say, I'm a person who's volunteered to educate on these questions, rather than asking the person that we might know casually or personally, who's afraid of how we're going to react to the information they transmit to us, right? It's really scary. And to remind yourself that if someone, I remember when I came out to my mom as gay, she was just like, but why didn't you tell me before? And why didn't you know that I was always going to love you? And I was just like, well, currently I'm 18 and I don't know, like I was scared and I don't want you to feel bad, but I can't also be the person to like rabbi to you and help you not feel bad, right? I was thankful that I found a group called Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays. And I sent her there and said, why don't you talk to some other parents who've been through this, right? Lots of ways that you can say to the person who comes out to you, thank you for telling me, right? And then do the education work that you need to do to find out what a person might need from you. The non-binary Hebrew, non-binaryhebrew.org actually just did a bet mitzvah for a non-binary student. So instead of a bar or bat mitzvah, it was a bet mitzvah. And the grandfather is a Sabra, a native Israeli, lives in Tel Aviv, and he couldn't get enough. Like he was just like, hooray, I can use all the adjectives and verbs. So, it's slowly being incorporated into communities. Some folks are also using, I do this a lot for conversion, instead of bar or bat, or ben or bat someone, naming a baby as mi beit, from the house of. Also really helpful in cases, for example, of queer folks who have families of origin who have abused or rejected them, or anyone whose families of origin has abused or rejected them, and they don't want to have their parents' name, for example, on their ketubah. Right? I've had folks who have been identified as their name, mi beit, and then the name of their sibling, right, who's the member of their family who affirms them. Again, these are innovations that happen in some communities and not others, not always on denominational lines. But I think these are ones that are helping us to live by the laws that are in the Torah and not die by the laws that are in the Torah. And I thank you all for being willing to learn and to expand your own notion of how many sexes the rabbis thought there were. And again, any questions are really, really welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rabbi, and thank you, folks, for coming. This was amazing. Extraordinary evening. Thank you so much.
Happy Pride Month.
Happy Pride. Hashi, you're muted.
Happy Pride, everyone.
Happy Pride.
Thank
you,
Thanks all
Rabbi.
for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Toda rabba.
Thank you so much.
Please.
Fred, I should have publicly thanked you there.
That's okay.
It was like gargantuan effort of like, I'm like, show this now, show this. It was like,
No problem.
I'm doing this on purpose. Like
my first time. It was
excellent. It really felt seamless. It was really
okay. I'm glad, and
it felt seamless to me.
This was amazing. I really
thank you so much. Thank you so much. It was really gave me a good opportunity to distill a bunch of things that have been sort of floating around separately in my teaching, and so that's it's really great. And I'll have soon my new article about non-binary inclusion and ritual is coming out soon. But yeah, hope to be at RODF in person sometime.
Yes, please, soon. I can't wait to be back at RODF in person sometime.
Yeah. Thank you again so much. What a great community.
All right, my pleasure. Have a great night. Thank you.